Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Get Out of Rap, and I'm joined again by overwhelming public demand, let's say, Stuart Dorman, Chief Innovation Officer from Sabio. Hi Stu, thanks for coming back on.
Hey Martin, thanks. It was really enjoyed the last show, so really good to be back.
Yeah, it was just, there were people, it was a campaign. They didn't hear enough
Great, that's
because
good to
we had a
hear.
lot of topics that we could have talked about. And as is the way with these things, the conversation goes a certain way. So
Mm,
just remembering where we were. Um, One of the things really, and it's one I'm definitely interested in, but I feel like I have a gap,
mm,
is in AI, and I know it's
yeah.
something you're knowledgeable and passionate about.
Hmm.
Where for you did the whole concept, especially when you think about contact centers, but where for you did the whole concept of AI first start becoming a thing? What is its history for us?
So um, we've been building speech applications for contact centers now at Sabio. I've been heavily involved in this for probably, certainly over 15 years. So that speech is a form of AI, if you like, and historically, it was much more structured in terms of the way that we would use speech to engage a customer, to allow them in a more natural way to express what it is they were looking to do, and to capture information from that customer to allow them to complete a task. And obviously, speech is just a more natural way of doing that than pressing buttons on a telephone keypad. And it obviously allows you to access more information. So things like alphanumeric, postcodes and vehicle registration numbers and, more complex entities, if you like, that we can capture from callers that you just simply couldn't do with a telephone keypad. So many people probably wouldn't refer to that as AI in the way that we think of it today, but it's certainly, using a form of artificial intelligence, which is, the use of speech recognition to allow customers, as I say, to interact in a more natural way. Over the last few years in particular, we've seen a real explosion in the use of this technology, predominantly driven by the big cloud vendors, the Microsofts and the Amazons and the Googles in particular. And lots of people had a lot more exposure to this technology through the likes of Alexa and Siri. They could issue commands to these devices, and people started to become more familiar with it. But the underlying technology that was driving that change as well in the cloud, particularly the use of machine learning, has resulted in significant improvements in the abilities of that technology to converse with people in a more natural way, to allow us to be much more open in the way that we engage with a computer to accomplish a task. And we're now seeing the application of that technology to the contact center, where we can, expand on the capabilities of what we would once have called an IVR and start to do much more complex things with it, both on the chat channel, which we know as chatbots, and now increasingly on the voice channel, which we once would have called an IVR. People call it a voice bot now, but it's actually much more sophisticated than that. Now, the way I tend to think of this, really, it's a bit like we've just introduced another user interface. And if you kind of take it back, maybe even over 20 years, for the last couple of decades, we've seen digital tools manifested through graphical user interfaces, if you like, so the web and then mobile applications, as creating these tools that we as customers could use to interact with organizations and actually get things done and accomplish tasks and make payments and make purchases and so on. And we're still a long way from that being perfect. We're still on that journey, 20 plus years in. We still see lots of organizations that really haven't exploited the web as a digital channel yet as a way of engaging their customers. But the challenges with graphical user interfaces are that they can be quite rigid. So, you might have a caller or a customer, if you like, that has a really good understanding of your product or your service. They maybe understand the terminology that's used in your industry, and they might breeze through, accomplishing a task on a graphical user interface, which is quite natural to them. But if it's somebody that is less comfortable, less familiar using those tools. Maybe they haven't made the effort to seek out and find where they can actually carry that task out, or maybe they just have a few questions and they don't have the assurance to accomplish that task on a graphical user interface. Historically, they would have had to have picked up the phone and called the call center, and that's what humans are great at. We can talk to customers and adapt our language and conversation in a way that customers can understand, and they can probe and query and ask questions and gain confidence before completing that task in a way they couldn't have always have done with a graphical user interface. And for me, I think this is where conversational user interfaces start to come into play, because they allow organizations to expose their processes in a way that's much more natural for people to understand and to probe and to converse and gain the confidence before they get the task done. So I think that's kind of where we are in this journey. And I think that's where AI, in the context of contact centers and customer services right now, we're probably right now where e-commerce was 20 years ago. We're kind of at those early stages of it becoming a way of opening up the engagement between a customer and an organization. But like I say, there's still a huge opportunity and still a long way to go.
That's fascinating, first of all, but do you think then, to help with this evolvement, that the concept of kind of continual improvement is really important? Because as a consumer, or reading and just being in a customer focused world, you'll often hear, or I've had experiences of thinking, I need to contact this company. I will prefer to use their web chat, and I understand it's not a human. It feels like a challenge to overcome, to think, right, I'm somehow going to have to find the right phrase that it will refer me to a human.
Yeah.
Is part of this what you're saying here about this evolvement, that companies will have to understand it's far better for me not to see this as a challenge to overcome, rather how, do they learn from it and think, why is this person trying to just constantly say, refer me to an agent, or why is it that they can't service that element of my request in the same way?
Your first point is so crucial. This idea about this being an organic, ongoing process, much in the way that you would bring in a new starter to your organization and you would continually develop them to understand your processes and improve the way they engage with customers and just get better at what they do. The same principles apply to conversational AI, conversational design. And starting small is crucial in our experience. Going on a journey which will take many years, it's something that organizations need to commit to for the long term, to really exploit what this technology can deliver for them. I think it's really important to look at this as a long-term thing. And I think it's important to start thinking about the tasks that agents in call centers in particular do today. And I sometimes refer to them as human APIs. If you're just processing a task for a customer simply because it's too hard for that customer to carry out the task themselves on the website, i.e. it's too complicated, or they can't find it, or maybe they can't be bothered in some cases. But the human in that instance isn't really adding huge amounts of value. They're simply translating the conversation and inputting it into a system. That's something I think that this technology can do relatively quickly to streamline that process and make it much better for customers, because they're not having to sit in a queue and wait to get through to somebody, but equally free up the role of the human in the contact center to actually focus on where they can add value. And I think where they can add value is reassuring customers, allowing them to probe and get a better understanding about whatever process or service or product it is they're looking to consume from you as an organization. And that's what humans are good at. And I think if we can make sure that they are focused on that, and not having to just be human APIs and transact and, you know, process data from a customer into a system. I think that's where the real opportunities are. Now, obviously, as this technology increases in sophistication, it will allow more probing to take place, if you like, from the customer, and allow them to maybe deviate off in a different direction, get a question answered, get some reassurance, and then process that task. But, you know, it's an ongoing process of evolution to get the technology to perform in that way. And like I say, that's a multi-year journey.
And that, I mean, I wouldn't want to come across as a Luddite. I utilize and love the technology when it works, and it throws up all kinds of, in a way, like philosophical questions. It's interesting to hear your point around where we as humans in the contact center world and the frontline team members and agents sort of fit into this changing environment. Because for me, everything of worth happens in a relationship.
Yeah.
And I guess what you're saying then is we'll have to skill people better to be able to deal with these more escalated queries, you would like to think, and be able to and be skilled enough to establish a relationship, maybe quicker, better than they currently do, because so much has been done by AI before that.
Yeah. And I think, you know, you can look at AI, but you can also, it's in that context, it probably makes sense to look at it as another digital technology, because the same arguments apply to the web or to mobile apps. You know, they're all they're doing is streamlining the ability for the customer to accomplish a task in a way that doesn't involve a human. So you're right. You know, what does that do to the relationship with the customer? Does it diminish it, or does it improve it, because the customer is able to get things done much quicker without having to sit in a queue and speak to somebody? At least for the simple things, you know, at least for those simple tasks, or at least accessing information or making payments, or, you know, and those, obviously the complexity of those tasks will grow over time. But then freeing up time for the things that you've just described, which are relationship building, being there for the customer, being able to take time to build a relationship and understand what they're looking to do, and adding value where it you know, the value is needed, you know, in terms of like I say, you know, not just processing simple interactions, but actually explaining and you know, building a strong relationship. I really think that's where the future of the contact center sits, you know, as that front line in customer experience. It's spending more time doing those things and equipping agents with the right tools to be able to focus on that relationship, instead of having to work lots of different platforms and systems and user interfaces. So that's yeah, I think that's the direction that I see things heading.
Do you think the pandemic has made people more receptive, or broken down maybe some misperceptions, because more and more things have been done in a different way? Just thinking about maybe how you interact with your GP, which was, you know, let's be honest, previously a bastion of traditional, there's a get past the receptionist and then speak to the, you know, now certainly it's online, it's quick, you can do a lot of it now without even speaking to anyone.
Yeah.
Will we kind of look back, do you think, at the pandemic and think that this has given us a bit of a leg up?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, some people say that it's accelerated things by 5 or 10 years. I think really? Possibly even, I think it's accelerated some things by an entire generation. I really do think it's,
wow.
You know, the last year, 2020, has been an absolutely profound year in terms of the way that we as a society, I think, operate, you know, the way that we engage with each other and with organizations. And I think arguably that's kickstarted things like the environmental movement, which has been there for years, but all of a sudden we're taking things like that seriously. You know, it's ushered in so much change, and I think when we're through this pandemic and out the other side, I think we'll look back as there being a huge amount of positive change that's come out of this. And you mentioned doctors as one example. And I think we touched on this in the last podcast. You know, a lot of these technologies have been around for years. The ability to do video and share screens and stuff like that, but they haven't really been embraced. And what the pandemics force people to do in many cases is to start to use these technologies in a really positive way to engage with organizations to get access healthcare. And largely speaking, it's been incredibly positive. And we're still in the early stages, but it's driven a huge amount of productivity into the system, into healthcare, into organizations, into customer service. And so I think we'll definitely continue to take advantage of some of these changes that have taken place. And equally, if you think about it from a consumer perspective, you know, we all know people that would never have dreamed of doing their shopping online, you know, ordering their groceries online or doing their banking online. These are people that, because of the pandemic, have been forced to do it. And again, quite a few of those, doesn't mean they're never going to go to the supermarket again, but they will certainly think and have more confidence in engaging in e-commerce, you know, for groceries, for buying clothes, etc., because they've been forced to do it, and they've actually learned that it works pretty well for them. So yeah, I think it's really quite exciting, some of the changes that are being ushered in because of what happened in 2020, and I think it's just a real pivotal point in the way that we as a society, you know, engage with and embrace technology in the way that we conduct our day-to-day lives.
I just want to ask you about, in your experience, maybe with some of your clients, you don't need to name them, of course, but who are the ones in the call center world that you would say are getting it right when it comes to using AI and like implementing it, using it to the benefit of their employees and their customers?
Yeah.
Who, you know, what are there any commonalities that they all share that you could share now, sort of kind of tips on, if you're going to do it, these are the things you need to do to get it right?
Yeah, sure. So I think almost starting with some of the challenges that we see first as a good way of starting, sort of framing the conversation, because the technology now has become quite democratized. You know, it's become easier to use. It's become much cheaper. It's accessible from the cloud. We've seen lots of organizations start to experiment with building simple chatbots and frequently asked questions, and, you know, with a couple of dialogue turns, as we call it, a couple of questions and answers, and actually think, oh, this is pretty easy, you know, we can build this out. But they're massively underestimating the complexity of building out a full conversation or conversational journey that can come close to, you know, replicating some of the conversations that take place in a call center, let's say. So if you think about every turn of the dialogue, every question and answer response, it almost becomes exponentially more hard to manage the conversation, simply because we as humans go off in different tangents. You know, there's 1,000 different ways that we can ask a question. There's a lot of different ways that we can respond. You know, we often hesitate, you know, we go back on things and we ask questions again. So managing that complexity and trying to build and design an AI, if you like, to replicate what a fully, end-to-end conversation becomes incredibly difficult, incredibly quickly. So often one of the failures that we see is that organizations to start going down this route have a bit of success with their simple applications, but massively underestimate the commitment that it takes to really make this work at scale. And
you come back in a week and they've written on the walls, they've gone completely insane.
Yeah, exactly. Chatbot done, tick. Yeah, okay, now, let's put it in the call center and crikey, you know. And that's what humans are great at. You know, we can respond, and we can, you know, adapt our language and rephrase questions and, we're just, it's such a natural way for us to converse, doing that through conversation. And like I say, it becomes very hard to do that at scale. But so it takes a lot of thought about design, and it takes a big commitment to making that work. And that commitment is about, firstly, I think, again, we talked about this before, but cross-functional teams, making sure that the operations are involved, because clearly they understand how customers converse, they understand the language that people use, making sure that there's an element of engineering development, because they're going to be needed to access the back-end systems, making sure that you think about design, conversational design. It takes someone that really understands, almost at a sort of psychological level, how we as humans converse, and to construct and engineer conversations in that way. These are all the types of skills that we have within Sabio, and that organizations need if they're really going to embrace this. So it's very much about process. It's very much about organizational design, to make sure you've got these people and these teams in place working together. It's about, to your point at the start, thinking in an agile way, and making change in an iterative way that leverages data, and we live in a constantly changing world where you've got new products and services coming out the whole time, and obviously the AI needs to adapt to that and understand that, and therefore it needs constant input to be able to understand what's going on. I mean, COVID as a word didn't even barely exist 12 months ago. So you need to tell the system what that is, and how to respond to it. So I think that's the profile of organizations that really are leading this, and I mean world leading. Some of our clients, I think, are really world leading in this space. Those are the kind of elements of not just technology, but organizational design, agile thinking. Those are those elements that they've actually got together and are really working to help them take advantage of this technology. We're doing some really great work with an organization called HomeServe at the moment. You probably have all heard of them. Been a customer of ours for many years at Sabio, but I would say that they are really do have a world leading approach to implementing this technology. They're committed to the long run. They've got a really solid sort of 5-year program of rolling this technology out. They've already seen some fantastic wins, but they're just really set up to exploit what this technology can do for them, and it's delivering sort of great experiences for customers. But it's a really key part of the call center as we know it today. I think call centers of the future are not just going to be made up of people, they're going to be made up of technology, and it's important to get that really, that right blend of people and technology, and the technology being controlled by the call center as a way of engaging with customers in the future. We've got another really good example, a customer of ours called Love Holidays, and they're also using this technology, but in a slightly different way. So they're using it within the call center to help agents out. So, and what happens with Love Holidays is that the technology listens into the conversation that's taking place between the advisor and the customer, and is there to offer suggestions and present bits of knowledge or information that might be useful to help the agent, conduct the conversation. Or if it's a chat conversation, if it's a web chat conversation, which increasingly I think a lot of their demand is through web chat, it's just constantly, offering up suggestions of how to respond, based on maybe what the most successful agent in the call center is how they're responding to customers, and sort of adapting the language based on that. So it's being used as a helper. It's being used to drive more productivity and more effectiveness, but also, at the same time, educating advisors on how to respond, and just making it much quicker for them to get a quality response back to the customer. So there's a couple of examples there of what I consider to be world-leading, implementations of this technology. And, we've got lots of other customers that are in similar situations as well.
I really like the kind of reminder that actually it can be inward facing to help streamline and get your teams just operating that kind of top performer modeling
Mm.
to utilize AI to kind of really understand why someone is good and then help share that in a really consistent, agile way to
Yeah.
the wider team is great. I love the sound of that.
Yeah. It's in some ways it's a bit like, you talk about the way that self-driving cars work. And, if someone has a crash in Michigan, or, the system learns from it and it propagates that knowledge across every single car within the network, relatively quickly. That's how machine learning and the development of these algorithms works. And you can apply that same principle to the contact center, absolutely sharing that knowledge as quickly as possible. And also crucially, making it available at the right point in time, at people's fingertips at the exact second that they need it, so that they can respond in the right way. They're still in control of the conversation. They've just got a helper there that gives them information to respond quickly and in a knowledgeable way.
Do you, what would be your response or view on maybe, we're just in the UK, we've recently done a census, we haven't seen the results, but I imagine it's going to show we're an aging population. There's the demographics that we have. I've read some articles in the past around people being left behind, groups being left behind, and maybe the pandemic has actually helped people get up to speed.
Yeah.
But I imagine it's something that's kind of levied at technology quite often in terms of, if you think about our parents and grandparents and how savvy are they at being able to respond. A few years ago, and it's sort of making sure that our leadership team were all staying in touch. We did Back to the Floor. I loved it. It's where I started. And I thought I was doing really well. And I was speaking to an old lady and she said, "Oh, do you mind if I ask you a question?" I said, "Yeah, sure, by all means, go ahead." And she said, "Are you human?" And I like to think it was because I was sounding so polished.
Yeah.
But it really stuck with me and this was 5 years ago, I think. But
wow.
It made me think, if there's people that are worried about that, or this kind of the utilizing this technology worries people, what's your view on that?
That's a really interesting point. I love that question, and it's I think, to your first point, I do think that the pandemic has accelerated the uptake of digital tools, websites, mobile apps, etc. Because there's no doubt that the younger generations, and I'm talking about my kids here as much as anything, will just instinctively reach for a screen as the first point of carrying out a task or trying to do something. They use a screen to contact their friends. They've just been trained to do that, really, because it's there and it's ubiquitous. And I think our generation, are mostly fairly tech savvy as well. But we grew up being trained to pick the phone up and speak to people. And, it takes a long time to shift those behaviors. I think, we are doing it, obviously, but it's very easy for us to fall back on the phone as a way of, not quite sure about this, I'm going to speak to somebody to get this problem solved. And then I think probably older generations, again, it's a kind of spectrum, really. Older generations would always reach for the phone first and pick the phone up and try and speak to somebody. Now, the interesting thing I think about this technology is that it should, any great technology should ultimately become invisible. You shouldn't even realize that it's there. And I think that's what's quite exciting about conversational AI, really. And even if you think back to the web, and when we first started going online, it was actually quite a faff to get your laptop out, power it up. Some cases dial up in the early days, but then getting the process of getting online took you a few minutes, and that was an obstacle that got in the way. And we kind of take it for granted now. But again, when I know we touched on this before again, but the iPhone and the iPad came along, they were like instant on devices. You could instantly get online, and within a few seconds you were engaging in digital content. So that had a huge impact, I think, in encouraging people to go to that channel first and use digital tools as their first point of contact, even if it was just to browse a website, find the phone number, and then pick the phone up. You know, at least we were encouraging people to do that. But now we're at the point where even if people do pick the phone up, or if they go online, but particularly if they pick the phone up, we're starting to be able to treat the phone as a digital channel. And that's how we got to think of it. You know, by putting a voice bot on the end of a phone, it becomes a digital channel, just one that we happen to converse with using our voice, as opposed to, you know, a graphical interface that we use our eyes to engage with. And therefore, I think, you know, will come a point where the lady that you spoke to will probably be right. You know, I think it probably will get to the point where the act of having a conversation with an AI is almost indistinguishable from the conversation with a human. And that's a good thing. Now, what we need to be careful of is that we don't kind of hoodwink people into thinking they're talking to a human when actually they're talking to a bot. But that's just a design thing, you know, that's just a, you know, we just need to make it clear to people. And what's quite interesting, you know, even if you think about where this particular technology is heading, particularly with the progress that we're seeing around synthesized voice at the moment. And you probably, I don't know if you saw recently, there was a deep fake around, I think it was Tom Cruise online, and the deep fake had, you know, it used a machine learning algorithm to replicate Tom Cruise's voice and actually his image as well. And it was almost indistinguishable from him, you know, so people get hoodwinked into that kind of thing. Now, imagine if you get called by someone in a call center and it sounds just like your mum, or, you know, just like somebody that you know, it's targeting that specifically at you, and it's trying to use that as a way of connecting with you to try and maybe convince you to buy something, or, you know.
Well, if my mum's suggesting it, I'm going to do the opposite.
Well, yeah, exactly. It's a fair point. But the point being, you know, the technology is moving quickly enough for it to be indistinguishable. I think that you're speaking to a chatbot or a voice bot versus a human, and equally, you know, that the voice itself can be tailored very specifically either to you as an individual or certainly to you as a brand, so that the advert I've just heard on TV, the person speaking sounds exactly like the person that answers the call when I call into your organization. It feels like I'm speaking to that celebrity, or, you know, that person that I've just heard on the advert. So I think there are some moral and, you know, ethical considerations that we need to factor in to make sure that people are clear that they are engaging with a bit of technology versus engaging with a human. And I think they'll just, you know, the moral compass of most organizations will mean that they try to make that as clear as possible.
I think there's something in that though around, I was just thinking then, just as a consumer myself, ultimately, if I'm engaging with a company, I have a desire, I want something, I need something done. If it's done and I'm treated well, that's ultimately all I want. And I guess if technology enables a consistently good level of service to be delivered, because that even used to be something starting as a team leader and then as an operations, I would think as a customer, sometimes it depends whether you get Jack or Laura as to how good your service is going to be. Because I know if you get Laura, it's going to be brilliant. Jack, if it's a night after he's done five-a-side football, it's not going to be great for the first few hours. You know, I guess this kind of deployment of technology done the right way, still supported and enhanced by humans, should see us raise standards of customer service.
I think it should do, yeah, and like I say, you know, you've got, if you're simply calling in to accomplish a task and get something done, then I think that's where this technology delivers a lot of value, because you can get that thing done super quickly without having to sit in a queue and speak to somebody. And I think that's a good thing. When you sort of tip beyond just wanting to get something done to seeking advice or seeking reassurance or, looking for help, I think that's where the human touch really starts to come into play and come into its own. And what we need to get really good at doing is using the technology to identify people that are on that journey and get them really quickly to the person that can solve their problem and has the most knowledge around that particular issue, to deliver a great experience. And then filter out those simple transactional things and just hopefully try and solve them, using the digital technology. And in terms of, the inconsistencies between us as humans, I think that obviously that they will always exist, and that could depend on, like you say, it could be the time of day, it could be whether you've had a good night or a bad night, or an argument with your wife or husband at home or something like that. All of those things can affect how we're performing. And that I guess that's just human. That's what makes it interesting, really, isn't it? That's just human nature. But I think we just need to make sure that we are able to use the tools, the AI tools and the digital tools, to, if somebody is going off track, maybe give them a nudge and saying, make sure you keep the conversation on track. Have you, here's a suggested response. We can use it as a bit of a coach, as well as just taking the interaction away completely and automating it to help people deliver a better experience.
And what do you think then? I guess this must be a question you get asked all the time, actually. Where's this all heading? So for the ways that we work and the ways we're going to be working, where's it going, or where would you like to see it go?
So I think, I think it's realistic over the next few years for organizations to if they take this seriously and really embrace this technology, to possibly optimize the demand in their contact center, maybe by reducing, some of our clients are looking at sort of anywhere between 20 and 30, maybe even 40% of those simple tasks being taken away and automated. But that, again, targeting the remaining interactions to individuals that really have a deep understanding about how to solve those problems. And I think really that will be better for customers, because they'll be able to get their simple problem solved really quickly. And it should be better for, the people that work within the organization, because they're doing more interesting things. And I also, by the way, think that, and I think we touched on this before, but, for every call that's taken away by digital technology, there's the contact center itself is evolving and taking on more tasks as the high street evolves, as we do more through digital channels, and we need that help and support. So, I think the role of the contact center itself is expanding almost at the same time, if you like, as digital technology is taking away those simple transactional tasks. So, I do think that over the next few years, pretty much every interaction that hits a call center will be fronted with a chatbot or a voice bot of some sort. I sort of refer to it a bit like a concierge. Let's at least ask the customer, hey, thank you for calling, how can I help you today? And use it a bit like a concierge to establish what their intent is, and then make a decision off the back of it. That's a really smart use of this technology, and it gives you a really solid foundation from which to build and grow the capabilities based on what's actually happening, as opposed to what you think might be happening. So I think that's where it's heading. But we are a long way away, decades away from the technology being able to answer all of the myriad of complex, questions and inquiries that most contact centers take today. We're a long way from this dystopian vision, if you like, of AI being able to answer any question. But I think organizations that really should be thinking about this now and starting on this journey, a bit like when you first put your website out there, you have to accept that you're not just going to switch it on and within 6 months it's all going to be perfect and it's going to be ready to use and customers are going to embrace it. It really is an ongoing multi-year journey. The technology will improve over that period. People's understanding of how to use it improves. It becomes cheaper and lower cost, to build things and do things. So getting started as soon as possible, I think, is the right thing to do, and just starting to make it just a part of how you run your operation.
And I guess it must be that you have to have identified something where you think the use of a chatbot or a voice bot can make an improvement, as opposed to just thinking, oh, we really should be jumping on this bandwagon. Because you might see benefits, I guess, but unless you're doing it to make a specific improvement or to overcome a specific challenge, well, I guess you must see this all the time, as people going, I think we should have it, but they don't really know why.
Yeah, and I think that, as I sort of touched on earlier, has led to quite a few people getting excited about what the technology can do, building something that they think is solving a problem, putting it live, and the reality is it doesn't really have much of a proper business impact. And therefore they've thought, actually, this doesn't really work, this technology is not working, let's back out and maybe let's look somewhere else for the next exciting thing. In our experience, identifying the best use cases for this technology should be driven by the customer. And what I mean by that is, you switch it on and you just let it sit there for a while, passively asking questions of customers. Hey, how can I help you? Customer says, oh, I'm looking to do X, Y, Z today. And then just passing that on to the call center in the way that you would do normally. But gradually, and I say gradually, we typically would run this over an 8-week period where we process a number of calls through the platform. We listen to why people are calling, and we let the data drive the process. We let the data that we capture from customers inform where the opportunities are to sort of build, step 2, step 3, step 4, and continue on that journey. So everything that we do is driven by data, and by data that's being generated by customers. And quite often what you see is there might be some really, really simple inquiries about, I don't know, maybe opening hours or something like that, something really simple that, today would be falling through there and getting through to a call center agent and just wasting their time. But you can often pick off these simple inquiries quite quickly, and, within a relatively short space of time, start delivering value. But also at the same time, quantifying the opportunities for some of those bigger, more complex tasks that people are calling in about, and just really using the data to inform where the opportunities are, what the cost will be to deflect this, this inquiry, what will the impact be on customer experience, and how long will it take us to build this out. And then you can just apply, a simple return on investment to look at that and decide whether it's worthwhile doing or not.
Well, this has been really illuminating and informative, as was the previous one, and we still have a number of topics left to go through. So absolutely, as long as you're okay with it, come back on and we'll do another one in the next couple of weeks. But Stu from Sabio, thanks very much for sharing your knowledge. I definitely found it informative, and I know people will have done who listen as well. So thanks very much for coming on.
Brilliant. Thanks again for having me.